The most violent cities in the world are usually found in Latin America or South Africa. But one of the most chaotic is buried deep in Australia's red centre, and it's not talked about enough. Alice Springs, a small town of about 26,000 people, has become the symbol of a crisis Australia doesn't want to deal with. Youth crime, violent assaults, alcohol chaos, break-ins, armed brawls, and a justice system that barely functions. At night, it's not uncommon to see teenagers roaming the streets in groups, throwing rocks, smashing windows, torching cars. Shops are locked up with steel shutters, locals don't go outside after sunset, and the police, even they hesitate in certain areas. The craziest part is that the entire situation has gotten so out of control that everyone can see it, but no one wants to touch it, especially not the government. So, how did Alice Springs become Australia's unofficial crime capital? Why is it spiraling and what's being done about it? Let's take a walk through the red centre and break down the real story behind Alice Springs. Alice Springs sits dead in the centre of Australia, literally. Drop your finger in the middle of the map and you'll land on it. A town surrounded in every direction by thousands of kilometres of red dust, dry riverbeds, and nothingness. It's remote in a way most people can't even picture. The kind of place where if you break down, you're not waiting for a tow truck, you're waiting for a miracle. The town began in the 1870s as a critical stop on the Overland Telegraph Line, a massive engineering project that connected Adelaide in the south to Darwin in the north, and eventually the rest of the world. Back then, it wasn't even called Alice, it was known as Stuart, named after the explorer John McDouall Stuart, who helped map the interior. The nearby waterhole, which was essential for early telegraph crews, was named Alice Spring after Alice Todd, the wife of Sir Charles Todd. Charles Todd was the superintendent of telegraphs and the brains behind the Overland Telegraph. It was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of its time, cutting a path through thousands of kilometres of desert to bring Australia into the global communications network. And like a lot of places in colonial Australia, it was named after a woman who never actually saw it. Alice Todd lived in Adelaide and she never stepped foot in the outback town that would eventually carry her name. Despite its isolation, Alice Springs started to grow. It became a supply depot during World War II. After the war, it turned into a quirky frontier town, half military, half tourism, and somehow thriving in the middle of nowhere. By the late 20th century, it had evolved into a proper regional centre with shops, schools, pubs, and a surprising amount of foot traffic for a place so far off the grid. And just outside of town, tucked away from view, sits Pine Gap, one of the most secretive and strategically important US military facilities in the world. Officially, it's a joint defense base run by the US and Australia. Unofficially, it's the beating heart of satellite surveillance across the globe. It's been active since the Cold War, and it still plays a role in drone operations and global intelligence. Most locals can't get anywhere near it, but its presence has always loomed large, a strange counterbalance to the poverty, dysfunction, and lawlessness just kilometers away. On one side of town, one of the most advanced intelligence hubs on Earth. On the other, broken homes, boarded windows, and kids aimlessly walking the streets. But here's the thing. For all its growth, Alice Springs never really grew together. The town developed, but not in a way that met the needs of everyone, especially not the Aboriginals who'd lived there for tens of thousands of years before the telegraph lines, roads, or fences ever arrived. That imbalance between the modern town and the traditional custodians of the land is at the core of everything that followed. Alice Springs has one of the highest Indigenous populations of any towns in Australia. This is the living heart of Central Australia's Aboriginal culture. You see it in the people, the language, the art, the stories, but you also see the gap between the history and the reality. You can't talk about that gap without mentioning the stolen generation, a government policy that, for decades, saw Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their families and placed in white institutions, missions, or foster care. The goal was assimilation, and these policies lasted well into the 20th century, and many of the families affected lived in or around Alice Springs. Generations were torn apart, language and culture suppressed, and the trauma didn't end when the removal stopped. It passed down, quietly, painfully, shaping the identity and future of kids growing up in Alice today. Grandparents who were taken, parents who were displaced, children still living in the aftermath of policies that tried to erase who they were. All across the fringes of Alice are the town camps, clusters of Aboriginal housing areas that were never designed to be permanent. Most started out as informal campsites, places where Indigenous families who weren't welcome in the town centre could settle. Over time, the government fenced them off, added basic housing, and gave them official names. But even today, most camps still lack proper infrastructure. Roads are potholed, drainage is poor, some homes are damaged beyond repair, but still occupied. It's common to find entire extended families sharing a 2-bedroom space, with no air conditioning and intermittent power. Security patrols and police drive through regularly to keep order. Most homes have metal screens over the windows, and some are boarded up entirely. And in the middle of it all, kids, growing up in conditions that are overcrowded, overstressed, and deeply disconnected from both traditional cultural grounding and mainstream society. And that's the crux of it. These communities are being systematically set up to struggle. The impact of colonization didn't stop with European settlement. The trauma of the stolen generation, years of underfunded services, neglected health, poor schooling, housing shortages, it all adds up, and it doesn't disappear. It passes on from one generation to the next. This dysfunction is unfortunately what many of the Aboriginal people growing up in Alice are caught in. Too removed from their culture to feel rooted in it, too alienated from modern institutions to feel included in them. So they drift. And that drifting, that cultural dislocation, is a major reason why things start to break down. Because when you have nowhere to belong, nowhere to feel safe, and no real future in sight, you start creating your own rules. Now, let's be real. Yes, historical trauma matters. Yes, we need to understand how colonization and forced removals shaped what we see today. Policies like the stolen generation left scars that haven't healed. Many of the grandparents and parents of today's kids in Alice grew up with that trauma. It didn't vanish when the policies ended. It passed down, affecting identity, stability, and trust in institutions. But understanding history isn't the same as excusing chaos, because in recent years, Alice Springs has experienced a crime wave so intense it's impossible to ignore. This isn't media spin, nor is it fear-mongering. This is a lived reality for the people who live and work there. Assaults, property damage, home invasions, car thefts, public brawls, all happening with disturbing regularity. And while crime stats are debated, even the government admits things have escalated rapidly. Some suburbs have seen crime jump by over 100%. But you don't need to look at spreadsheets to get it, you just need to walk around. This isn't organized crime, it's not bikies or drug cartels. What's happening in Alice is more chaotic, and in some ways more dangerous. It's groups of unsupervised, disconnected kids, most of them Indigenous, shaped by years of trauma, neglect, and broken institutions, who have learned there are no real consequences. Most of these kids are out on the streets after dark. Some are from town camps, others from distant communities where schools are under-resourced, jobs are scarce, and boredom is a fact of life. Alice offers lights, shops, people, but no real structure or support, so they drift, alone or in packs, and when there's no guidance, no purpose, and no accountability, things unravel quickly. Cars get stolen and torched for kicks, businesses are vandalized, people get assaulted walking home or waiting at bus stops. For many residents, it's become a new normal, one built on tension and unpredictability. Locals have adapted. Most won't walk outside after sunset. Suburbs that once felt quiet now lock down early. Bottle shops and supermarkets hire private security. Fast food joints install metal shutters, and some businesses have turned their storefronts into mini fortresses. Reinforced glass, steel doors, floodlights, like they're preparing for a siege. And the system? Well, it's completely overwhelmed because it isn't built to deal with them. The youth justice laws in the Northern Territory are intentionally soft, designed with rehabilitation in mind, not punishment. And that sounds great, in theory, but in practice, it's a disaster. Police are under-resourced, courts are overloaded, and detention centers are full. So when a 13-year-old racks up 25 offenses, The result is often a warning, maybe a night in holding, and then back on the street, and they know it. Word gets around. These kids know the limits. They know what they can get away with and how little consequence there'll be. And once that line disappears, it's game on. At the heart of this crisis is alcohol, or more accurately, the chaos around how it's controlled. In many Aboriginal communities across the Northern Territory, alcohol is flat out banned. They're hard-coded into federal law, first rolled out during the 2007 intervention and later rebranded under legislation like Stronger Futures. The original idea was to reduce domestic violence and social harm in vulnerable communities. But nearly 2 decades later, it's become something else entirely, a pressure valve that's redirected the problem instead of solving it. Because here's what happens. People from dry communities drive into Alice Springs to drink. Simple. That's the closest place where alcohol is legal. But the town, already small and under-resourced, isn't built to absorb that kind of social pressure, especially not nightly. So Alice Springs responded by locking things down, hard. Today, it has some of the strictest alcohol laws anywhere in Australia, and probably even the world. Actual police officers are stationed outside every bottle shop. There's ID scanners at the doors. Every purchase is logged. Your address gets checked on an iPad to see if you're flagged as being from a restricted area. If you live in a town camp, even if you've never been in trouble, never had a drink in public, never been violent, you can be automatically banned from buying booze. And it doesn't stop there. Some pubs have rules that limit Aboriginal patrons to a fixed number of drinks per night, 4, maybe 6, while everyone else drinks freely. Staff monitor how much you've had and track your table. In some venues, it's a soft cutoff. In others, it's enforced like a curfew. The whole thing feels arbitrary and to many, blatantly discriminatory. But here's the thing, none of this has worked, not in the long term. People still drink because people will always find a way to drink. The only difference is where it happens now. Instead of safe, regulated environments, drinking gets pushed into the streets, the parks, the riverbeds. It's public, it's chaotic, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. And when the pubs close, usually around 2 a.m, all that tension gets dumped out onto the footpaths. That's when the trouble starts. Drunken arguments boil over, fights break out, property gets vandalized. Police scramble to respond, but they're often overwhelmed. Local residents know the drill. As soon as the bars start clearing out, you get indoors, lock your gates, stay off the streets. It's a system that punishes the symptom while ignoring the disease. People aren't drinking because they're lawless, they're drinking because they're bored, stressed, cut off, or dealing with trauma that hasn't been addressed in any meaningful way. And yet, the official response remains the same: restrict, monitor, ban. The result is more pressure, more resentment, more chaos, and a town that, every night, becomes a pressure cooker with a broken lid. And yet, despite the rise in crime, the government's response has been, to put it bluntly, light, patchy, and painfully slow. Sure, there's been fly-in visits from politicians, committees formed, reviews launched, and speeches made, but if you ask almost anyone living in Alice Springs, the answer's always the same. Nothing real is changing, not on the ground, not where it matters. And here's the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to say aloud. A lot of Australians are losing patience. Not with Aboriginal people, not with kids in crisis, but with a system that seems to reward dysfunction, excuse bad behaviour, and offer no accountability to anyone. Australians are stuck in an impossible middle, especially those living in Alice Springs. On one hand, they're told to be compassionate, to understand the trauma, the history, and the cultural pain behind the dysfunction. And they do. Most people get that. They're not heartless. They know this didn't come out of nowhere. But on the other hand, they're living in a community that's unraveling. People are scared. Workers are getting attacked, pensioners are getting robbed, small business owners are closing shops not because they failed, but because they're exhausted from being broken into every other week. This isn't an abstract societal problem. This is an everyday reality, and it's brutal. And no one in power seems willing to admit that both things can be true. Compassion doesn't mean accepting chaos. You can care deeply about historical injustice and still want the kid who smashed your window or threatened your partner to face consequences. You can support Indigenous people and still feel furious that your neighborhood needs private security just to keep a fast food joint open past 7 p.m. You can acknowledge colonization and the stolen generation and still be furious that your teenage daughter doesn't feel safe walking home from the bus stop. You can hold both truths, but our politics don't allow room for that. It's either or. You're either compassionate or reactionary. You're either progressive or punitive. People have been patient, they've waited, they've hoped the government would show up and do something real, but instead, they've been abandoned. Because every level of government, local, territory, and federal, is too scared of the political blowback. They're terrified that anything firm, anything decisive, will be labelled racist or authoritarian. So they do what modern politicians do best: perform outrage, announce a task force, and disappear once the cameras are off. This is theatre disguised as governance. It's a pantomime of leadership, press releases, photo ops, and jargon-filled strategy documents that don't change a single damn thing on the ground. And what do they actually do? They throw money at the problem. Millions in things like emergency funds, pop-up youth hubs, pilot programs that last 6 months and vanish, all of it designed to look like action without taking any real risk. Because risk means responsibility, and responsibility is political poison. So instead of nuance, we get nothing. Leaders too afraid of backlash to act, institutions too hollow to intervene, and locals left to clean up the mess with no real support. You've got kids running around with no structure, no purpose, and no consequence. You've got exhausted police, overwhelmed courts, and detention centers bursting at the seams. You've got locals locking themselves in at night, and you've got bureaucrats in Darwin and Canberra fiddling with guidelines and saying community-led responses are being explored. We're past the point of exploring. The house is on fire and the government's still writing a feasibility study. There's no bold thinking, no long-term vision, and no one willing to say, this is the plan and we're committing to it for the next 10 years, no matter the politics. Because here's the reality. The kids causing the chaos, they've been failed twice. First by history, and now by a government too cowardly to step up. It's not about race, it's not about ideology, it's about a basic question of whether the people in charge are capable of governing at all. People are ultimately tired of being gaslit, told that things are improving when anyone who's walked the streets of Alice at night knows that they're not. And they're tired of being painted as racist or reactionary for wanting the most basic thing a government should provide: safety. Now, this is where compassion fatigue starts to set in. People are getting tired of caring and getting nothing back. Tired of being told it's all too complicated to fix while the situation on the ground keeps getting worse. So, if the government thinks that doing nothing is the safer political option, they're wrong. Because the longer this continues, the harder it'll be to rebuild trust on any side. The people of Alice Springs, and frankly Australians across the country, aren't asking for miracle solutions. They're asking for honesty, for courage, for leadership that isn't terrified of the optics. They're asking for policies that actually work, policies that actually make communities safer and stronger. The truth is, Alice Springs isn't an isolated case. It's a magnifying glass, zooming in on Australia's biggest unresolved issues: colonial fallout, systemic inequality, and a country still struggling with how to live alongside Aboriginal people. The violence, the crime, the dysfunction, none of it exists in a vacuum. It's what happens when entire communities are left without services, without opportunity, and without hope. When governments over-legislate but under-deliver, when media swings between moral panic and complete disinterest, Alice pays the price. It's a place where the cracks in the national story are too big to cover up, where the impact of 200 years of policy failure isn't academic, it's unfolding night after night in real time. Despite everything though, Alice Springs isn't broken beyond repair. In fact, some of the most inspiring work is already being done by the community itself. There are local programs run by Aboriginal leaders that work with youth through sport, art, and cultural connection. Some boxing gyms and mentoring groups have been incredibly effective in steering young people away from violence. Health workers and social workers on the ground are doing what they can with extremely limited resources. The issue is scale. These community-led solutions exist, but without sustained funding and long-term political backing, they're band-aids on bullet wounds. Real change would mean things like expanding housing in town camps and rebuilding trust between communities and police. There's no quick fix. It won't fit into a 3-minute news segment, but it's the only way out. And to be fair, there has been some movement lately. As of July 2025, the Northern Territory government has flagged changes to the youth justice laws, aiming to make it easier to deny bail to repeat offenders and close some of the loopholes that have allowed chronic youth crime to spiral. But how effective that'll be? Too early to tell. Legislation might be shifting, but on the streets, the cycle's still spinning. So there you have it. Alice Springs, Australia's most dangerous city. Not just statistically, but also dangerous because it exposes how badly Australia is failing its most vulnerable communities. It's dangerous because it shows what happens when government policy doesn't match lived reality. It's a real place with real people caught in absolute chaos, and ignoring it won't make it go away. But what do you think? Should Australia be introducing tougher laws for youth offenders, or would that only make the problem worse? Do you think the government is avoiding Alice Springs because it's politically sensitive, or do they simply not care? Would pumping in more money solve anything, or does this come down to rebuilding trust and community from the ground up? And most importantly, can Alice Springs turn things around, or has it already reached a breaking point? If you found this video interesting, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more deep dives. And if you've lived in Alice or visited recently, share your experience below. The more voices we hear, the better the conversation. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and make sure to stay curious.